Understanding China has never been more important and more difficult. Takshashila's latest executive capsule course, Watching China, is an all virtual course that will help you decode China's politics and policies. Learn about the party state structure, ideology, and policy drivers. Master the language of Communist Party discourse and open source research. The course is perfect for professionals, journalists, students, or anyone curious about the Asian giant. Sign up now on the link in the description to start understanding China like never before.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. My name is Kripa Koshy, and I'm a program manager with the Takshashila Institution. And today I have the pleasure of being joined by my colleague, Suman Joshi, who also is a program manager with the Policy School here at Takshashila. I consider this a special episode because I've not yet had the opportunity to invite Suman as a guest to discuss. We have conversations at length, I know, in the office and in person, but not yet had a chance to record. So I'm really happy that I've managed to snag her for this. Welcome, Suman. Officially, I'm inviting you here and welcoming you.
My pleasure entirely, Kripa. Thank you. Thanks for calling me on this show. And I'm sure we'll have fun talking on this show.
Yeah, I hope so.
The topic is not the most fun of talk.
That's right. We're going to try and infuse a little bit of optimism and good humor as we have the conversation. But you're right, as Suman alluded to, the topic today is going to be maybe a little bit heavier, but we're looking at loneliness today. And particularly the impetus for looking into the subject was a lot of recent news that came up in the past few months around an announcement from the City of Seoul announcing that they'd be spending nearly $325 million over the next 5 years. And to quote, create a city where no one is lonely. And so today I just want to invite Suman here to sort of unpack with me, some of the considerations around something like this, to understand what role does government play in trying to tackle something like this that's a fairly prevalent social issue. We'll also touch on maybe some of the features of the specific policies that the City of Seoul has announced, and then sort of understand, why do we even care about loneliness? We can understand that it instinctively, maybe we can recognize it as problematic, but in the context of it requiring a policy intervention, why is it something that we care about?
It feels a little strange because not strange, but it's a little different. It's unlike other health issues that we discuss, right? Loneliness is very individual. It is specific to each person, and each person's drivers for being lonely or for not being lonely are very different. It could be circumstance at a particular point in time, or it could be the nature of a person itself, like more introverted, more not introverted, whatever. It could be the nature of the person making him or her more lonely, or it could be a certain circumstance, maybe going through a rough time, whatever else is making a person. So to bring a government perspective or government role into something that is so personal is indeed interesting, I should say, because clearly they see it as a big problem that is impacting them, right? So you should take us through what the thinking in Seoul is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think listeners will sort of find that as we unpack some of this, that we'll realize that it's not unique to a city context, right? That we can actually apply some of these realities across different contexts as well. But just so that, everyone's sort of on the same page over here, as Suman just mentioned, loneliness is a subjective condition where you feel the sense of psychological sort of isolation. But really why maybe it's considered often a public health concern is because there is a correlation then with all other kinds of health problems, which include mental illness, cardiovascular disease, premature mortality in some instances. And so when some of these health conditions are exacerbated, does place, an additional burden on the healthcare system, and also has an impact on the productivity of the individual in question, which in turn can affect, maybe some of the economic outcomes possibly of a country, and in this instance, maybe of the city. So from that perspective, maybe that's why maybe we see loneliness come up in the context of public health conversations. Interestingly, just to note for the global context as well, as we zoom out slightly, in November 2023, the WHO launched an official commission on social connection. And this idea was, they want to address loneliness as this pressing health threat, and they wanted to promote social connection as a priority, and try to find solutions across, different countries of different incomes. But ultimately, their, I think, end goal was to see it as an issue that's recognized and resourced as a public health priority. So there is a little bit of context setting that's happened, or recognition at the global level as well, that loneliness pervades into our everyday life, and society sort of in a very real way.
I mean, you summed it up well, but just for a little more, a little stepping back and understanding why this is something that the government should look at, or why we should be worried about. So in economics or economic reasoning, we talk about externalities, and we talk about the need for government intervention when there is a negative externality, right? Which is why you have governments that will come in when we need some kind of vaccination, like for COVID, right? So because governments recognize the need for everybody to be vaccinated so that everyone is safe, the governments actually incentivized or pushed the vaccination programs really aggressively. However, this is not that case. But what is the case then for something like this for the government to take up? Because this is not that case, because me being lonely does not affect you in any which way. Okay. Physically or anything. I'm not passing on any kind of germs or any kind of viruses that will impact you. So it's a very specific me problem. So the government, it is a healthcare issue, but not a public health issue. The two are different. And so we call this more of a healthcare issue. But we have also seen in the recent past things like diabetes, the NCDs, non-communicable diseases, diabetes, hypertension. We are seeing like an epidemic proportion, especially in India, where we are supposed to be the diabetes capital of the world. We are seeing that governments are increasingly playing a role in terms of just awareness campaigns, in terms of, say, what it chooses to, say, subsidize, finance, whatever else that you can say. So there is, although it is a very individual problem and not something that affects everyone at large, there is a role for the government to play, because, it can impact, like you said, it can impact productivity and therefore other economic outcomes. Moving away from just the economics of it, it also impacts societal structures, the way society gets changed or gets impacted by all of these things. So I think that is where the role of the government, that is why we see the government stepping in. And especially in Korea, or particularly Seoul, we see that they are having a lot of human capital issues coming up. Their fertility rates are really low. So they have thrown a lot of money behind the problem. Similarly, this is another problem that they see. And therefore, and since all of this is actually impacting their structures and probably the economy, that is why they're going after this in a big way, right? Is that somewhat connected? Do you feel like I'm making sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's a good distinction to sort of draw as to what, once we sort of frame what the problem is, we can sort of better understand what a good intervention might possibly be for it. And I think just for a little bit of context around, how the city of Seoul seems to be seeing it, and what they've sort of announced a few sort of policy interventions that they'd like to implement in the city as part of this campaign that they're going to be running over the next 5 years. So the first thing that they've requested is that people use, this 24/7 counseling hotline. This idea that they want to have an online platform for counseling. They want in-person visits and consultations that they're doing. They're trying to expand psychological services, green spaces that might be available for people. They're talking about, having meal plans for those who are slightly elderly residents. And maybe it'll be interesting eventually, someone to tap into, what the demographics of layout is looking for some of these challenges. Is it exclusively a younger population, older? And I think there might be some interesting trends that come up over there. Another thing that they want to probably implement is a search system, which essentially is to try and identify isolated residents. They want to encourage, find, incentives to sort of push people outside the house. And interestingly, I don't know if you recall in the news a while ago in 2023, at the time, South Korea's Ministry of Gender Equality and Family said that they wanted to actually pay socially isolated youth around $500 a month to encourage them to go out and mingle in society. So this is very telling of the way that the city of Seoul and South Korea, maybe generally, is framing this problem, how they understand like a good intervention might possibly be to tackle it. But even in this, like, we've alluded to earlier, there are a few different shortcomings. Like, so what do you think? Do you feel like these are, if we can establish this as an issue that government needs to care about, and we're seeing these city level interventions, do you think that you think they'll be meaningful, make any change in a realistic way?
I think it's a great first step. It's a great start. But I'm really not sure how much, just throwing money behind it, does it help? Incentives can have, they can play out very differently. Right? So if you're throwing money at this and telling lonely people to come out and, take the money that is up for grabs, how are you going to decide who's the lonely person? Anybody can go take that money. And somebody like me who's not lonely also may just, self-declare myself as lonely and go pick up that, And does that really help? Does that bring down the problem? So really financial incentives in this case, I am not really sure they would work. Because even in their the other problem that they had, the low fertility rate that they had, they threw a lot of money behind it and said that they would give men extended paternity leave, they would be exempt from armed forces services, conscription, whatever their idea of conscription is, a lot of other things, but people were just not willing to take that. It's not attractive enough, right? So similarly here, when it is such a individual, personal, mental issue, I don't really see how money will really work. But the other things that you said, like helpline or any of this, or creating spaces for meeting, etc., I think they do good. But for that, the person should realize that he or she is lonely. What about people who don't even think that they are lonely people, or who don't want to? How do you bring them out? Right? The root of that problem is not being tackled through these interventions, but in some ways, maybe they are like a good start. What is your take?
Yeah, I think so. What you're saying actually ties well with even some of the academic commentary on some of these policy interventions, right? So I know there was this one sociology professor in particular from the National University of Singapore who had said, like you just said, the policy itself doesn't prevent loneliness. It's to prevent perhaps the lonely deaths, which is there is a terminology for this in South Korea as well, but to prevent the lonely deaths of those who might be isolated. It is really good, I think, to try and create a bit of an ecosystem where people feel like they have the opportunity. But I would imagine that it can be fairly challenging to take that first step as well, right? So you can have all the right resources around you. And that might maybe solve, the problem for a certain segment of the population. But I wonder if it'll sufficiently be able to capture in the net people who might not find within themselves that motivation to even take the first step to leave their home. And, do I want a healthcare worker coming and knocking at my door, insisting that we have a conversation about why my day has been tough? I don't know. Like, I'd much rather be allowed to retain my autonomy to engage in the full spectrum of human emotion that, we are all entitled to experience. So it's interesting. Of course, the government sees it as a pressing issue, but to be able to tackle it in sort of a nuanced way, I think is going to be the challenge. I think you're right. Like, it's a good starting point, but yeah.
So you have read about this. So what is actually causing this epidemic of sorts, loneliness epidemic? Is it the way people it can't be the way they are because it's just started now, right? So it's not some genetic something that has changed. So it has to be something that is more societal. It has to be something that is extrinsic or external to individuals, as you know. So what in your opinion has actually caused this?
Sure. No, I think it's a good question because I think we are social beings and there is a desire to gather in groups, to have social interaction. I think that that's a fairly natural sort of instinctive sort of tendency that I think humans have. But, if we're focusing our discussion on this particular cultural context of that in South Korea, there is a fair bit of commentary on the fact that there's a very aggressive and competitive culture that is sort of bred from a very young age in the country as well. And I can see parallels that might exist even in the Indian context. And this, the push to grow economically as well, that, and South Korea has such a remarkable story of economic growth, but a lot of that has come perhaps at the cost of having to breed a very aggressive competitive culture. And so there are, a few academics who talk about this idea of creating this competitive environment actually makes people feel more withdrawn, more isolated. You're perpetually in this state of comparing yourself to somebody else. And, should you feel that you're falling short when compared to the competition, then you are right and prime ready to feel that sense of inadequacy and that, wanting to feel a deep sense of failure. The other interesting thing is a study actually that I came across that was released, like mid last year, so June 2024, that talked about, some of the nuance of Korean culture, which I think is shared in Indian culture, is this relational orientation, this idea that we have a very collectivist society where we always define ourselves, it feels like, in relation to other people, right? So putting aside the competition element, but just this idea that my efforts are meaningful if it contributes to a greater societal cause, or my efforts are meaningful if it can help my community, my group, my family. And if you feel like you're not making a significant impact on others, then and you're measuring your sense of worth against that, then you are going to fall short. You are going to feel that sense of inadequacy again, and that sense of failure as well contributes to this feeling of isolation and loneliness, right? So, and then other factors in Korea as well. There is, single person households have gone up, like we were talking about the drop even in maybe sometimes the family unit structure. We see that social media plays a really big part of it. So if we're talking about external factors, like technology is a really big part of it, and changes in technology as well. But I'm really curious to hear your thought on that. So how do you think tech sort of features in this whole conversation, Suman?
I have always felt that tech helps because it helps to connect people, right? In the sense that I have seen people around me, older people, who have gotten back in, like, it may not be the younger generation as such, but loneliness exists even in the older demography, right? I have seen people getting back in touch with people they had lost touch with, people like distant relatives, friends, etc. And it is creating us, and the distances are so vast these days. So, physical distances, it's not possible for everybody to go meet everyone else. So it's bringing a lot of people together on one platform. So they're talking to each other of course, on their phones. But I mean, all that is great. To one level, it helps. At least that there is somebody who is listening to you and all of that. But does it really, substitute for personal human touch? I don't think so. Right? So tech, again, is very useful in some ways, but it can also lead to withdrawal. Like, I could be connected to everybody around the world, but if I'm not connected to somebody in my neighborhood, I think there's a problem with that, right? So when we're talking about digital communities or all of that, I think that physical proximity, I mean, people living around you, if you don't interact much with them, I think that there's a bit of a miss over there. So I really feel tech helps in some ways, but it's not a substitute for any kind of personal interaction with others. So there is a role that it plays.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, you bringing up the idea that, particularly in older generation, you might see there's an affinity to technology because it helps you connect to a network that maybe you've lost touch with. But I'm thinking of other sort of, if we're thinking about that older demographic, some of the other challenges that they might face because of the the evolving sort of realities of living in contemporary India, right? Like migration, for example, plays a really big part of it. So I can imagine that because of sort of even migratory trends that are happening in such a way, you might have an older member of the family who might become more reliant on technology in that way, because the social structure that they had that would support them sometimes is slowly dismantling when you have the younger people moving to the cities as well, right? So what else do you think, sort of if we bring this conversation back to the Indian context, what are you think some of the features that we should be mindful of when we're thinking of how loneliness is being perhaps exacerbated over here for us?
For India, I think it's a peculiar situation because we are a very crowded country. So it's hard to be lonely. It's hard to not meet people. But loneliness is not just being around people. Loneliness is a state of mind, right? You could be in an ocean of people and still feel lonely. But I think the way societal structures work in India, the joint family system, or even close proximity living, like apartments or whatever we live in, apartment communities, whatever, all of that, in some ways help with the loneliness issue. Okay, at least you have human contact, unlike a lot of other places where there is no contact with other humans in a long time. Okay, you can choose to live without human contact for a longer period of time than when you are in India, right? In India, you don't have a choice. You will be running into people wherever you go. And the joint family system has helped to maintain some kind of cohesion and therefore reduce loneliness in a lot of ways. But now again, like you said, migration, like as we urbanize more, and which is good for us, we see a trend of people moving from the villages to the cities. You could see two kinds of lonely people: people who stay back and feel left out or feel secluded, and people who move in also who do not have enough of social bonds here, that you have to build those bonds and you don't have your own people or whatever you call them, right? There are loneliness can come in both ways. And so I'm really not sure whether it's a problem that we should worry about at this point in time, because we're still a very young country. But in 20, 30 years, as this demographic dividend just begins to slow down, then we have this issue. So it's important for us to think about it in terms of how will we deal with this, much like we think about elder care or whatever else. This will become an important part of that whole thing. And we already see a lot of older people having this loneliness issue, right? People who have their kids abroad or wherever else.
Sure.
Yeah. So how do we build communities for them? I'm not sure government is best placed to actually tackle this problem. How do we build communities for them? How do they actually connect with each other? What is the role of social capital? Again, we talk so much of social capital, bonding, bridging capital. So how do we move across different groups to build that capital so that you feel lonely in your older age? Those are things that we should think about in the Indian context. Right?
I mean, I think we need to have more building WhatsApp groups. I feel like that's the solution. Because I feel like that's the place where we have an older generation is having, that's their social interaction, maybe. They want to be involved.
We can do an entire episode on building WhatsApp too.
Okay, we'll reserve that for a part 2 discussion. But it's also reminding me of when you speak of an older and a younger generation, both can have a unique experience of loneliness, right? It's not an experience that's reserved for one particular demographic group. I'm thinking of even, recently we were discussing that movie, All We Imagine Is Light, where, the central protagonists there are two women who've migrated to a city. And, the world is their oyster in some ways. They no longer have some of the familial burdens or the societal expectations that would have maybe been placed on them, as it were, in an urban setting, in a rural setting. And yet you see, one of the protagonists really struggling with feeling incredibly lonely in a city as bustling as Mumbai is.
Yeah, that's what I said. You could be amongst the notion of people and yet feel lonely, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting to contrast some of what you're saying with, does this hold true in more individualistic cultures, right? And a lot of the conversation on loneliness tends to be those that are focused on these sort of industrialized nations. The UK, US are sort of the examples. But if I'm sort of casting my gaze to other cultural contexts, and could there be areas where we could borrow, some particular ideas and see if it may possibly work. And now I think a important disclaimer maybe here to make is that a lot of these suggestions I think that I'm going to mention are primarily from the government intervention side. And I don't want to lose the point that you said of the role that other actors in society need to play, how civil society organizations can be more engaged, perhaps, or how markets can step in some way.
Yeah.
But just
Think about like an app for elderly, or I don't know. What else can the market come up with? Market can come
for
up
sure.
with, like,
And there have been these interventions.
all of
Absolutely. Especially I'm thinking of like the interventions that are possible through AI. It's like a whole different ball game. And I feel like we're missing like a certain Bharat Reddy in this conversation to also give us, his perspective.
Yeah.
So when we do part two, we perhaps will invite him. But yeah, so I was just looking at some of the sort of other contexts as well to sort of pull other examples and reference points. And it was really interesting to me that in 2023 in the US, for example, the US Surgeon General at the time, Dr. Vivek Murthy, had sort of called attention to loneliness as being part of this national crisis of social disconnection, is what he called it. And there have been, a few sort of public health professionals that have weighed in and sort of said, okay, if we did have, a few policy measures, what could be something that works in our context, in this very more individualistic and more industrialized sort of context? So the first was, they said maybe strengthening social infrastructure, this idea of, have more public transports, because people feel actually that they're quite, disconnected in that sense, that they need to have better transport sort of systems in place. This idea of having
think
maybe
about it, no? If you're traveling in a car versus traveling in public transport. In the car, you're by
totally.
yourself. Right?
Totally. And I'm just thinking, I mean, I'm now going down the movie reference path, Suman, but I think it's because you're my guest today. So I feel very free. I'm thinking of, that scene in the lunchbox where you have one of the, I'm forgetting that the lead's name over there, but it's Irfan Khan is one of them. But he has sort of this colleague, these two colleagues. Yeah, but these two colleagues who are traveling on the train, on the Mumbai local again, and how so much of life is sort of playing out in that commute time. You have your regular people who are sitting beside you, or you might see or not see in the same bogie as you are. So yeah, exactly. The interaction possible through transportation is a big one. Then they were even suggesting things like programs where you can pair retirees with like young students. This idea that it pulls retired people from a place of isolation, allows for young children to even sometimes develop reading and social interaction skills. So that was something. So all that would fall under the remit of strengthening the social infrastructure. Then there was an interesting example that borrows actually from the UK, this idea of mobilizing the healthcare sector to do something. I think what's called social prescribing, where you can actually ask for professionals that are called link workers. So they work with the National Health Service over in the UK, who introduce patients who are seen at risk of loneliness to a lot of community resources, volunteering programs. So it's actually almost in a formalized medical prescriptive way that they're sort of participating or trying to pull people to participate in mainstream society. And then we already covered like a big part of the conversation in the UK and the US as well is social media. And they sort of see it as, look, social media has the possibility for a lot of social connection. How can we leverage it better? And maybe this is a good segue then into our conversation on where markets can step in and where society can sort of step in. But yeah, from those sort of two perspectives, is there anything in particular I know that would jump out to you, Suman, from so not the government side, but perhaps the society and markets?
And I think the government, if it does what it's supposed to do, anyway, will foster these things, right? Like I'm just going back to something I saw a few weeks ago, right across my house in a smallish restaurant. There was this whole group of senior citizens who had gathered there to celebrate somebody's birthday. Okay, so this whole group had gone, they meet at the local lake come park, which is next door. All of them, I think, walk around and they have some kind of a laughter club kind of thing. And so they have built those connections and they are here to celebrate. So they are all disparate people, but all of them together, some connection. I'm not saying everybody is going to be with everyone, but at least some part of the day you have, somebody else that you're talking to, and probably giving you food for thought for other things through the day, right? So those social connections are built through good public infrastructure. That meeting or that building of connections should not be a preserve of the elite. Only people who can probably go to clubs, who can probably meet up at coffee shops, or all of that. It should be a public infrastructure. It should be park that is open to everybody, irrespective of caste, culture, or caste, creed, whatever, all of them. So if you could do more of those, and therefore get more people to get out of their shell, and at least feel a little less lonely at least some part of the day, I think it's fairly a decent job to do. I mean, decent outcome to look at, right? So I think public infrastructure is very important from a government's point of view. And I mean, it's important for various other reasons and for this too. If I'm talking about societal structures, I think society evolves. Now, you're not going to change. You're not going to stop change. You're not going to stop the pace of change or way change happens. You're not going to say that, okay, people should not migrate. That's not going to happen. And that's not the right thing for us to even say. Right? But as society evolves, we should find our ways to tackle whatever problem comes our way. Today, it is loneliness. There could be other things that would come. And given the tech connectedness, I think there's always a tech solution, but again, it's not the be all end all of all solutions. I think that way. And markets have a role in terms of just building these things and providing services, like you have elder care services that it provides. You could have these other, counselling or whatever else services that they can come up with.
And I think one of the things that's sort of plaguing me still, I think, is this idea of competition, right? Like, and how the pressure that's placed through this idea, this prism of, competition being such an important fuel, it feels like, to have access to economic opportunities, to and of course, we don't want to do away with competition, of course, because it yields a lot of good as well to have a competitive environment. But I'm just thinking of what does it look like, particularly if we're thinking of a younger population that's trying
just
to
having more opportunities, at least will feel them less pressure to be looking at, if everybody 5,000 people or 50,000 people are gunning for one job there,
right,
is going to create, unnecessary competition. Creating more opportunities, jobs remains the fundamental thing that the government needs to focus on, I would think.
Right.
Making that environment conducive for jobs. And a lot of this will get solved, like in a lot of ways, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just even thinking of, what does it look like to, and this is a tough one, like possibly even shaping mindsets to not attach a sense of, self-worth to achieving certain types of societally determined sort of metrics of success, which can perhaps seem like a very trite thing to say when you're struggling to make ends meet, right? If you're just looking for your kid to have the best possible economic opportunity, because that would in turn has the ripple effect of giving them more freedom, gives them less burdens of family responsibilities, all these things. But I'm just like wondering, is there, what role then can that sort of play? Like, I liked very much that idea of like having intergenerational interaction even, right? Like having the opportunity to have access to people who've sort of walked a few years or decades sort of further than you and have a different perspective. And the more opportunity sometimes even to interact across generations allows for some of that perspective to be shared. That as much as you can enjoy economic success to some extent, that cannot be the fundamental core of your sense of identity. Yeah, but that's a trickier one, I think, to unpack. So
I think as individuals, I try my best not to dump it on my son, saying, you got to do better than this, whatever. But I think as individuals, we need to shift our lens a little bit so that we don't leave our kids lonely in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and I think that's a beautiful point to sort of end our conversation today. We did cover, I think, a lot of really good points. But I think if there were three sort of big ideas that maybe we would like the listener to focus on, what do you think they would be, Suman? Maybe you can just kick it off and then we can sort of together parse out. I think one, if I recall, was, I think tech was one that featured prominently in our conversation.
Yeah. And two, societal structures change, economic structures change, coping or making changes to our lifestyles or the ways we work is as important as expecting any other intervention from any other pillars of society itself. That is two.
And yeah. And then a third one, I think, was around, do we absolve government of the responsibility to step in here? I think we both kind of agree that the answer is probably no. We do feel that there is a role for government to sort of play. And then, of course, the conversation can evolve as to what is the most effective intervention. But given that it can be tied, I think, to sort of public health concerns, that there is room for the government still to be playing a part over here.
Sure. That would sum up.
Okay, fabulous. With that, I'm going to officially conclude our time together. Not again for a lack of interest or things to say. I think we could easily continue on for another half hour. But I'll conclude here and then we'll have perhaps a part two if the crowd wants it. But with that, I'll say thank you so much, Suman, for your perspective, for your time. I think it really made this an enriching conversation for me, at least. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Kripa. I enjoyed this too.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.